Never open your door during a storm, the elders always said. But on the night the sky seemed determined to tear itself apart, Emma Carter would break that rule. The first crack of thunder rattled the windows of her tiny cabin at the edge of Moonhaven Pact territory. Rain slammed against the roof in relentless waves, drumming so loudly it drowned out almost every other sound. Almost. Emma paused in the middle of stacking firewood beside the stone hearth. Her fingers tightened around a split log as she listened. There it was again, a faint sound beneath the storm. 3 slow knocks. Her stomach tightened instantly. Nobody visited her. Not willingly. At 22, Emma had become nearly invisible to her pack. She was an omega without status, without influence, and without the kind of strength the others admired. Most days, people barely looked at her. On bad days, they looked only long enough to remind her where she belonged. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin in a burst of white light. The knock came again, this time louder. Emma glanced toward the door. Every instinct told her to leave it closed. The storm had already swallowed most of the valley. Roads were flooded. Trees bent beneath powerful gusts. Whoever stood outside should have been seeking shelter hours ago. Yet something in the sound unsettled her. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't angry. It sounded tired. Before she could talk herself out of it, Emma crossed the room. Cold air seeped through the cracks around the wooden frame. Her hand rested on the latch. Thunder rolled overhead. She pulled the door open. Wind immediately rushed inside, carrying sheets of rain and the sharp scent of wet pine. A man stood on her porch. For a moment, Emma simply stared. Water streamed from his dark coat. His hair clung to his forehead. He looked as though he had been walking through the storm for miles. One side of his face glistened with rain, and his expression remained unreadable despite the weather raging around him. Yet it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. It was his eyes. Pale silver. Calm. Steady. The kind of eyes that seemed to notice everything. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was deep but measured. The road washed out several miles back. Emma blinked. "You've been out there this whole time?" He gave a small nod. "I only need shelter for the night." Behind him, lightning flashed again, outlining his broad silhouette against the darkness. Emma hesitated. Every lesson she had ever been taught warned against trusting strangers, especially strangers who appeared during storms. Yet as she looked at him standing alone in the cold rain, she felt something else. Not fear, not danger, just exhaustion. The kind she recognized because she carried it herself. "Come in," she said quietly. For the first time, surprise flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then it vanished. "Thank you." Emma stepped aside. The stranger entered the cabin, bringing the scent of rain and distant forests with him. The door closed behind them, shutting out the storm. Neither of them noticed that far beyond the cabin walls, hidden beneath the darkness and rain, several wolves watched from the tree line before silently disappearing back into the night. The warmth inside the cabin felt almost unreal after the storm. Emma moved another log into the fireplace, and orange light danced across the rough wooden walls. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The stranger stood near the door, water dripping from his coat onto the floorboards. He seemed careful not to take up too much space, which struck Emma as odd. Most wolves carried themselves with confidence. Some carried themselves with arrogance. This man carried himself like someone accustomed to being watched. "You can leave your coat there," Emma said quietly. He glanced toward the chair beside the hearth and nodded. As he removed the heavy coat, Emma noticed how worn it was. Not poor, not neglected, simply well used, as though it had traveled countless miles. She handed him a clean towel from a nearby shelf. "Thank you." His voice remained calm, but something about it felt different now. Softer, less guarded. Emma busied herself near the stove, filling a kettle with water. The silence between them should have felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. Rain continued to strike the windows, and wind occasionally rattled the cabin walls, but inside the small room, the world seemed distant. "You live alone?" the stranger asked after several minutes. Emma looked up. "Yes." His pale eyes studied her carefully. "That is unusual." She laughed softly. "Not for me." A shadow crossed his expression. "People leave you alone?" Emma placed 2 mugs on the table. Most of the time. It was not entirely true. People noticed her when they needed someone to blame or ignore. But explaining that to a stranger felt unnecessary. The kettle began to whistle. Emma poured hot water into both mugs and added dried herbs from a small tin. The scent filled the room immediately. "It is not much," she said, "but it helps during storms." He accepted the mug and looked down at the steam rising from it. For a moment, he did not drink. Instead, he seemed lost in thought. "You did not ask who I am." Emma shrugged. "You said you needed shelter. That was enough?" She met his gaze. Should it not be? Something unreadable flickered in his silver eyes. Not surprised this time. Something deeper. As if her answer had confirmed a question he had been carrying long before he reached her door. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley again. The stranger finally took a sip from the mug. A faint smile appeared. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger than she had first assumed. "It is good," he said. Emma smiled back despite herself. "My grandmother taught me." The stranger lowered his eyes briefly. "She sounds wise." The words carried a weight that made Emma wonder who he had lost. Before she could ask, another gust of wind swept around the cabin. Somewhere beyond the trees, distant howls drifted through the storm. Most wolves would not have noticed them beneath the rain. Emma did. So did the stranger. His attention shifted toward the window instantly. Alert, focused, watching. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed again. Emma frowned slightly. Whoever this man was, he was clearly not what he appeared to be. Yet as the fire crackled between them and the storm continued outside, she found herself trusting him anyway. She had no idea that before sunrise, the entire course of her life would begin to change. Emma woke to the sound of rain softening against the roof. For a few moments, she remained still beneath her blanket, listening. The violent storm that had swept across Moonhaven during the night had finally begun to lose its strength. The cabin felt warmer than usual, filled with the faint scent of cedarwood and the dying embers of the fire. Then she remembered she was not alone. Her eyes moved toward the hearth. The stranger was already awake. He sat quietly in the wooden chair facing the window, his attention fixed on the gray morning beyond the glass. He did not appear tired despite having spent the night traveling through the storm. In fact, he seemed more alert than ever. Emma slowly sat up. The floor creaked beneath her feet. The sound drew his attention immediately. Those pale silver eyes found her with surprising speed. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Emma replied. For some reason, her voice sounded smaller than usual. The stranger stood and stepped aside as she moved toward the stove. Outside, the clouds still covered most of the valley, but a few pale streaks of sunlight were beginning to break through. It looked as though the world had survived a difficult night. Emma gathered a few ingredients from her shelves and began preparing breakfast. She did not have much. Some eggs, bread, and dried fruit. Still, she arranged everything carefully. Her grandmother had always taught her that kindness was not measured by abundance. It was measured by intention. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. The stranger thanked her again before taking a bite. He seemed genuinely grateful, which felt unusual. Most people in Moonhaven rarely thanked her for anything. "You keep looking outside," Emma said eventually. A faint smile touched his lips. "Old habit. Waiting for someone?" His gaze drifted toward the window once more. "Perhaps." The answer raised more questions than it solved. Emma noticed that he often spoke that way, carefully, as though every sentence was being weighed before it was spoken aloud. Yet she found herself curious rather than suspicious. The morning continued quietly until a distant sound reached the cabin. Hooves. Several of them. Emma froze instantly. Riders rarely came this far toward the edge of packed territory. The stranger heard them too. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Recognition. He rose from the table and walked toward the door. Emma followed. Through the front window, shapes emerged from the mist. Large horses moved along the distant road. Several riders traveled together in dark cloaks. Even from this distance, their formation looked disciplined, organized, important. The stranger watched them for several seconds before exhaling slowly. "Your friends?" Emma asked. He looked at her. For a brief moment, something almost like amusement appeared in his eyes. Something like that. Before she could ask another question, the riders disappeared behind a line of pine trees. Silence returned to the valley. Yet Emma could not shake the strange feeling growing inside her chest. It felt as though she was standing at the edge of something unseen, something much larger than a passing storm. Across the room, the stranger glanced toward the road one final time. Then he turned back to her with a thoughtful expression, as though he had finally reached a decision about something important. The stranger remained standing near the window for several moments after the riders vanished into the mist. Emma watched him carefully while pretending to straighten the dishes on the table. There was something different about him now. The distance in his eyes had returned, as though part of his attention was no longer inside the cabin. It was somewhere beyond the valley, beyond Moonhaven itself. Finally, he turned toward her. "You have been very kind to me, Emma." Hearing her name spoken in his calm voice made her pause. She realized she had never learned his. Not really. He had never offered one. "You needed help," she replied simply. "Most people would have done the same." A faint smile touched his lips. "No," the answer came immediately. "Most people would not." Emma looked away first. She was not used to compliments. Certainly not sincere ones. Around Moonhaven, kindness was often treated as weakness. Her willingness to help others usually earned her extra work, not gratitude. The stranger stepped closer to the fireplace. Golden light flickered across his face. "Tell me something," he said. "Why do you stay here?" Emma frowned. "What do you mean? You deserve better than being hidden away at the edge of your pack." The words caught her off guard. She laughed softly, though there was little humor behind it. "You have only known me for one night. Sometimes one night is enough." Emma looked down at her hands. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, rain continued to fall lightly across the valley. "This is my home," she said at last. "Even when it hurts." The stranger seemed to consider that answer carefully. Loyalty is a rare thing. So is having somewhere to belong. Something changed in his expression then. A brief shadow. Gone almost instantly. Yet Emma sensed she had touched a truth he understood better than most. Before either of them could continue, a loud bell echoed faintly across the valley. Emma froze. The sound came from the center of Moonhaven. The pack bell. It was only used when every resident was required to gather. Another bell followed. Then another. Her stomach tightened immediately. "That is strange," she whispered. "What is it?" the stranger asked. "Nobody calls an assembly this early unless something important has happened." She moved toward the window. In the distance, she could already see people emerging from homes and heading toward the village square. The stranger remained silent behind her. "I should go," Emma said. "If I am late, Elder Barrett will find a reason to make my week miserable." To her surprise, the stranger laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh she had heard from him. Warm, unexpected, human. Emma found herself smiling in return. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a small silver coin. It gleamed softly in the firelight. "For your hospitality," he said. Emma immediately shook her head. "No, Emma. No." She folded her arms stubbornly. "You were a guest." For a long moment, the stranger simply stared at her. Then he carefully closed his hand around the coin again. "Very well." His silver eyes held hers. "But I will repay the debt another way." Emma rolled her eyes lightly. "There is no debt." The look he gave her then was impossible to read. Almost amused. Almost knowing. Outside, the bell rang once more. The stranger picked up his coat. "You should not keep your pack waiting," he said. Emma nodded and reached for her own jacket. Neither of them noticed that far beyond Moonhaven's borders, dozens of riders were already moving toward the valley with a single destination in mind. By the time Emma reached the center of Moonhaven, nearly the entire pack had gathered in the square. The storm clouds still hung low overhead, casting everything in shades of gray. Wolves stood in clusters, speaking in hushed voices while Elder Barrett occupied the raised platform at the center. Emma immediately noticed the stranger was no longer beside her. Somewhere between her cabin and the village, he had quietly disappeared. For reasons she could not explain, that realization left an unexpected emptiness in her chest. "About time," a sharp voice called out. Emma winced before she even turned. Lydia Mercer stood near the front of the crowd, her perfectly pressed coat untouched by the weather. Beside her, several others exchanged knowing looks. "Some of us managed to arrive without keeping the entire pack waiting," Lydia added. A few people laughed. Emma lowered her gaze. Drawing attention to herself never ended well. Elder Barrett raised a hand for silence. "We have received notice from the Northern Council," he announced. "A royal inspection will take place before sunset." The square immediately erupted with murmurs. Emma felt her stomach tighten. Royal inspections were rare, important, stressful. "Every resident is expected to assist in preparations," Barrett continued. Moonhaven will present itself with dignity. His eyes swept across the crowd before landing directly on Emma. Which brings me to another matter. A familiar feeling settled in her chest. The uncomfortable certainty that something unpleasant was about to happen. Several residents reported seeing an unknown man entering pack territory during last night's storm. The crowd shifted. Emma froze. A stranger, Barrett continued, taken into a private residence without authorization. Dozens of eyes turned toward her at once. Heat rushed into her face. Lydia folded her arms triumphantly. Imagine risking pack security because a handsome traveler knocked on your door. More laughter followed. Emma swallowed hard. He needed shelter. And naturally you volunteered, another voice said. How generous. The words sounded harmless, but the tone was not. Emma stared at the ground. Every sentence seemed designed to make her feel smaller. Barrett sighed heavily. Kindness without judgment becomes foolishness. Several wolves nodded in agreement. The man could have been anyone. Emma lifted her head. He was respectful. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Barrett's expression hardened. And because you know so much about strangers after one night? A ripple of amusement spread through the crowd. Emma immediately regretted speaking. Her hands tightened at her sides. She wished she could disappear. That had always been her secret talent. Becoming invisible. Enduring embarrassment quietly until people grew bored and moved on. Lydia stepped forward with a sweet smile that never reached her eyes. Perhaps our Emma was hoping the mysterious traveler would change her fortune. More laughter. Louder this time. Emma felt every stare like a weight pressing against her shoulders. Yet even as humiliation burned through her chest, she remembered the stranger's calm voice beside the fire. Most people would not have done what you did. For some reason, that memory steadied her. She straightened slightly. Not enough to challenge anyone. Just enough to remain standing. Across the square, the pack continued preparing for the royal inspection, completely unaware that before the day ended, the stranger they mocked her for helping would become the center of every conversation in Moonhaven. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Every corner of Moonhaven seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. Paths were swept clean. Banners were hung. Storefronts were polished until they gleamed beneath the fading afternoon light. Even the wolves who usually complained about everything worked without argument. Royal inspections had a way of inspiring cooperation. Emma spent most of the afternoon carrying supplies between buildings and helping arrange tables in the village square. Nobody thanked her. Nobody expected to. That part was familiar. What felt unfamiliar was the constant feeling that someone was missing. More than once, she caught herself glancing toward the road leading out of town. Each time she felt foolish afterward. The stranger had left. He owed her nothing. Yet his absence lingered in her thoughts. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, a horn echoed across the valley. The sound was deep and commanding. Every conversation stopped instantly. Wolves turned toward the northern road. A second horn followed. Then a third. Emma's pulse quickened. Around her, pack members hurried into position. Elder Barrett adjusted his formal coat for the 5th time in as many minutes. Lydia suddenly looked far less confident than usual. Dust appeared along the distant road. At first, Emma could only make out shadows moving through the evening light. Then the shapes became clearer. Riders. Dozens of them. Their formation stretched nearly a quarter-mile along the road. Dark horses moved in perfect order. Silver banners bearing the crest of the Northern Territories fluttered in the wind. The crowd fell silent. Emma had never seen anything like it. The riders approached with quiet authority. No shouting. No displays. They did not need them. Their presence alone commanded attention. At the front rode several figures wearing black cloaks trimmed with silver. Even from a distance, people instinctively stepped back. Elder Barrett lowered his head respectfully. Others followed. The atmosphere changed completely. It felt as though the entire valley was holding its breath. The procession entered the square and gradually slowed. Horses came to a halt. The lead riders dismounted smoothly. One of them stepped forward and surveyed the gathered crowd. His voice carried easily across the square. Prepare yourselves. The simple words sent another wave of tension through the village. Emma swallowed. Beside her, she heard someone whisper a prayer. Then movement caught her eye. A larger horse emerged from the center of the procession. Unlike the others, its rider remained partially hidden beneath a dark traveling cloak. The horse advanced slowly through the crowd. Every rider around him seemed instinctively aware of his position. Protective, respectful, important. Emma felt a strange sensation in her chest. Recognition. Impossible recognition. The rider stopped near the center of the square. Silence spread across Moonhaven. Not a single voice spoke. Not a single horse moved. Then the cloaked figure lifted his head. Emma's breath caught. Even before she could see his face clearly, she knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew. And as the rider slowly reached for the hood of his cloak, the entire village seemed to freeze in anticipation. The rider lowered his hood, and a collective gasp swept through Moonhaven. Emma felt the air leave her lungs. Pale silver eyes met hers across the crowded square. The same eyes that had watched the rain from her cabin window. The same eyes that had thanked her for a simple meal. The same eyes she had seen beside her fire only hours ago. For a moment, the entire world seemed to blur around her. She could hear nothing except the pounding of her own heartbeat. It was him, the stranger. The realization hit so suddenly that she almost questioned her own memory. Yet there was no mistake. Beneath the fading evening light, he looked different from the traveler who had stood on her porch. Not because his face had changed, but because everything around him had changed. Authority surrounded him like an invisible force. Confidence, presence, the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to command. Elder Barrett's face had gone completely pale. Lydia looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Around them, every member of the pack stared in stunned silence. One of the royal guards stepped forward and bowed his head respectfully toward the rider. "Your Majesty," he said clearly. The words echoed through the square. Emma froze. "Your Majesty." The title seemed impossible. Yet dozens of guards immediately lowered their heads. The village fell into absolute silence. Alpha King Alexander. Blackwood slowly dismounted. His boots touched the ground with calm precision. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emma remembered every conversation they had shared, every quiet moment beside the fire, every question he had asked. Suddenly those memories carried an entirely different meaning. He had never told her who he was. Not once. Yet somehow that hurt less than it should have, because she realized something important. He had never lied to her either. Alexander surveyed the square calmly. His gaze passed over Elder Barrett, over Lydia, over the gathered wolves. Then it found Emma again. The warmth she had seen beside the fireplace returned briefly to his expression. It lasted only a second, but she saw it. So did several others. Confusion spread through the crowd. Elder Barrett immediately stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, Moonhaven welcomes you. We are honored beyond words." Alexander acknowledged him with a small nod. "I appreciate the welcome." His voice carried easily across the square. Calm, controlled, powerful without effort. Barrett straightened carefully. "If there is anything our pack can provide, we stand ready to serve." For a moment, Alexander did not answer. Instead, he looked toward Emma once more. The silence stretched. Every eye in Moonhaven followed his gaze. Emma wished the ground would open beneath her feet. She had spent years avoiding attention. Now she stood at the center of it. Finally, Alexander spoke. "There is something your pack has already provided." Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. Elder Barrett frowned slightly. "Your Majesty?" Alexander's silver eyes never left Emma. "A kindness I will not forget." The words settled over the square like falling snow. Nobody understood them completely. Not yet. But Emma suddenly realized that the stranger she had sheltered during the storm had remembered every moment just as clearly as she had. The square remained frozen in silence. Nobody seemed willing to move, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter whatever was unfolding before them. Emma stood near the back of the gathering, her pulse racing so fast she could barely hear anything else. Around her, wolves exchanged confused glances. Some looked at her. Others looked at the Alpha King. None of them understood why his attention remained fixed on the Omega they usually ignored. Elder Barrett cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, if there is anything we can do to assist you during your visit, Moonhaven is honored to provide it." Alexander finally shifted his gaze toward the elder. "You already have." The answer only deepened the confusion. Barrett forced a smile. "I am afraid I do not understand." A faint breeze moved through the square, stirring the royal banners overhead. Alexander took a slow step forward. Then another. The crowd immediately parted to make room. Nobody dared remain in his path. Emma watched in disbelief as he continued walking. Not toward the council platform. Not toward the elders. Not toward the honored guests waiting near the front. Toward her. Her breath caught. Every instinct urged her to step backward, but her feet refused to move. The Alpha King crossed the square with calm confidence. Wolves lowered their heads as he passed. Royal guards remained silent behind him. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath. Emma could feel dozens of eyes following every step he took. Lydia's expression had become almost impossible to hide. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Alexander stopped directly in front of Emma. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of the storm flashed through her mind. The rain, the firelight, the quiet conversations inside her cabin. It felt impossible that less than a day had passed since then. Emma Carter, Alexander said. Hearing her full name from his lips sent another wave of silence through the crowd. Most people in Moonhaven barely remembered she existed. Yet the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories spoke her name as though it mattered. Emma swallowed hard. Your Majesty. A faint smile touched his face. The same smile she had seen while sharing breakfast. You do not need to sound so afraid. Several nearby wolves stared openly. Elder Barrett looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Alexander turned toward the crowd. His expression became serious once more. Last night, a storm swept across these lands. His voice carried effortlessly across the square. Roads disappeared. Travel became dangerous. Many doors remained closed. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Yet one door opened. His eyes found Emma again. One person offered shelter without asking for status, title, wealth, or reward. Emma felt her cheeks warm. She wished the ground would swallow her whole. Instead, Alexander extended his hand toward her. The simple gesture stunned the crowd. Kindness is not weakness, he said quietly. It is one of the rarest forms of strength. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. Then, one by one, members of the Royal Guard lowered their heads toward Emma. The motion spread through the square like a ripple across water. Wolves who had laughed at her only hours earlier suddenly found themselves unable to meet her eyes. And for the first time in her life, Emma was no longer invisible. Emma stared at the hand extended toward her. For years she had stood at the edges of gatherings exactly like this one. She had watched other wolves receive praise, attention, and recognition while she quietly faded into the background. Yet now the Alpha King himself stood before her, waiting patiently, as though there were no one else in the world worth his attention. Her fingers trembled slightly before she placed her hand in his. The moment she did, another wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Alexander helped her step forward, not because she needed assistance, but because he wanted everyone watching to see her clearly. Moonhaven's forgotten Omega was suddenly standing beside the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. Elder Barrett looked as though he wanted to speak, yet no words came. Lydia's confident smile had disappeared entirely. Emma felt dozens of eyes on her, but something was different now. For the first time, those stares did not carry judgment. They carried uncertainty, respect, curiosity. Alexander released her hand and addressed the crowd once more. The strength of a pack is not measured only by its warriors, he said. It is measured by the character of its people. The square remained silent. Last night, I was offered shelter by someone who expected nothing in return. No reward, no advantage, no recognition. His gaze softened as it returned to Emma. That kind of character cannot be taught. It cannot be purchased, and it should never be overlooked. Emma felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Nobody had ever spoken about her that way, not once in her entire life. Alexander reached into his coat and removed the silver coin she had refused earlier that morning. A faint smile touched his face. You told me there was no debt. Several wolves exchanged confused glances. Emma remembered the conversation instantly. I meant it, she said softly. I know. His voice carried only to her this time. But I still intend to honor what you gave me. He closed her fingers gently around the coin. It felt warm from his hand. A simple object. Yet somehow it felt far more important than silver. Above them, the clouds that had covered the valley all day finally began to break apart. Thin rays of golden sunlight spilled across the square. The timing was so perfect that several wolves glanced toward the sky in wonder. Alexander looked upward briefly before returning his attention to Emma. You opened your door during a storm, he said. Never apologize for that. Something in those words settled deep within her heart. The years of being ignored, The embarrassment, the loneliness, none of it disappeared completely. But for the first time, it no longer defined her. The royal procession soon prepared to depart. Horses were gathered. Guards returned to their positions. Yet before mounting his horse, Alexander paused beside Emma one final time. "Moonhaven is not far from the capital," he said. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." Emma felt her pulse quicken. Perhaps. A smile appeared in his silver eyes. Then he climbed into the saddle and turned toward the road. As the procession disappeared into the evening light, the entire village remained silent. Nobody laughed at Emma anymore. Nobody looked through her as though she were invisible. And standing in the center of the square with a silver coin resting in her palm, Emma realized that the storm had brought far more than rain. It had carried the beginning of a future she never imagined possible.